Russia's invasion of Ukraine is now preparing the ground for a new world order. Where does India fit into this order? Can we just stand by and watch these dramatic developments unfold? I'm Barkha Dutt, you're with the Mojo Story. Our top developments on this global crisis at this hour. Ukraine is appealing to the world for help, but that help beyond sanctions does not seem to be coming. The United States has made it clear that it will not be sending its soldiers to fight for Ukraine, not unless Putin sends his men into NATO countries. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has spoken with Vladimir Putin. India has urged a de escalation. Russia is saying it expects India to back it at the United Nations. India is using the instruments of conventional classic diplomacy and walking a tightrope here. We're standing here looking at a new world order emerge, one in which Russia and China seem to be increasingly calling the shots. How should India be responding to this global crisis, to Russia's act of war? That is our focus on the program today. What can India afford to and not afford to do? And also, where are our adversaries? Pakistan and China in the mix. It's no coincidence, perhaps, that Imran Khan has just met with Putin. Let's introduce our guests on the program today. We're joined by veteran diplomat, Ambassador Vivek Karju. Welcome to the program, sir. We're also welcoming to the program for a first-person account, Bhanu Sahani. Bhanu has lived and worked as a resident of Ukraine for years altogether. He's managed to get out of the war-torn area to come to Delhi, where he's with his father. We'll get a personal account from him. Jonah Blank, strategic affairs analyst, somebody who has worked with Biden in the past, is here to talk about America's response, one that many have criticized for being too waffly and weak-kneed. And we're also joined by Ambassador Navteej Sarna, veteran diplomat who's also served as ambassador of India to the United States of America. Welcome, everybody. Let me start actually by playing out what Joe Biden has said, making it clear that America will not be putting boots on the ground. In other words, what help can Ukraine really hope to get? It possibly cannot stand the assault of Russian troops that are just outside Kyiv as we speak. Listen in.
Although we provided over $650 million in defensive assistance to Ukraine just this last year, let me say it again. Our forces are not and will not be engaged in the conflict with Russia in Ukraine. Our forces are not going to Europe to fight in Ukraine, but to defend our NATO allies and reassure those allies in the East. As I made crystal clear, the United States will defend every inch of NATO territory with the full force of American power. And the good news is, NATO is more united and more determined than ever. There is no doubt that the United States and every NATO ally will meet our Article 5 commitments, which says an attack on one is an attack on all.
So Putin has managed to unite NATO, but is making it clear that American troops will fight for NATO nations and not for Ukraine. In other words, basically, Putin gets away. Ambassador Vivek Karju, is it fair to say right now that Russia will in fact get away with its act of war?
I think you really have to define what getaway means. Certainly, the Russians will create facts on the ground in Ukraine, and it will be difficult in the immediate future to wipe out these facts that have been created. We still don't know what will be the exact nature of these facts on the ground. Putin says that he has no intention for his forces to stay on in Ukraine. He's used these two words, demilitarization and denazification. And we really have to wait and watch what denazification means in its full implications. We have some ideas of what it means, but not the full. Demilitarization is clear. I think they want to denude Ukraine of any effective military capacity, and that is what the Russian forces seem to be doing. In the long term, however, it's not entirely clear. Again, I'm afraid there are many imponderables, and we have to acknowledge that what will be the precise strength of the sanctions that the NATO that NATO has imposed on Russia. Clearly, they are not willing to impose sanctions that will hurt their people. Uh, that is a weakness because you can't impose sanctions on the cheap. If Trump is worried how elections, midterm elections would go, then naturally Putin will, and much of the world will take a certain implication that when push comes to shove, America and its allies are still holding their hand. Perhaps they don't want the world economy to slide down into complete turmoil, but these lessons that are drawn will be there. So, Barkha, I'm afraid I haven't given you a satisfactory answer. I acknowledge that, but there are so many questions at the moment, and we really don't have full answers. We'll just have to wait and watch.
Given this absence of clarity, do you believe that India's cautious, classic, old-style response makes sense, Ambassador Karju?
I think India's dilemmas are very cruel. In fact, at the moment, they are far more cruel than they were during the Cold War. India faced these in 1956, in 68, and in 1979. But then India was not sort of straddling two ends of an arc, one arc in the Indo Pacific and the other arc in Europe. And there is a contradiction there. And it's not easy for India to resolve this contradiction. And at the moment, we've really had it on the cheap when we've appealed. In fact, that was the word used in the MEA readout of Prime Minister Modi and President Putin's conversation, that he's appealed for a cessation of violence. And I like the word violence. They haven't even used ingress of forces. They haven't used war. They haven't even used the term that Putin used, special military operations. They've used a
Yeah.
very anodyne word in this context, and Naftej is far better at this than I am. But they've used the word violence. Now, violence is really neither here nor there. But
Yeah.
that only illustrates the cruelty of India's dilemma at the moment. And I'm sure Prime Minister Modi and his colleagues are using every sense that they have to navigate this process in order to maintain India's interests.
Yeah.
Because we are, you know, on a tight rope, and the rope is getting tighter
By
as we speak.
contrast, by contrast to this anodyne response from India, or at least in the articulation of the words, is Imran Khan, who landed in Russia describing the situation of war as exciting. That is the exact word he used in video that leaked. And it's, we have those images of Imran Khan meeting with Putin. If we can play them in against the raging backdrop of this crisis. But as we wait for those images, Ambassador Navteej Sarna, there's Imran Khan, and as I said, he was caught talking about this being an exciting moment. A very peculiar thing has happened. You have the Russians, Navteej, talking about expecting India's support at the UN. And you have the Ukraine ambassador to India, and we'll play out that clip in just a moment, also hoping that Modi ji, as he called it, will prevail upon Putin. But isn't it true that India has very little skin in the game except for the consequences of a new world order? Ambassador Navteej Sarna, please.
Thank you, Barkha. Thank you for having me with this distinguished panel. I wouldn't agree with you that India has no skin in the game. Just there is no, this distance doesn't matter if we say in that sense. I think there's a lot of skin in the game because we are actually really facing now the narrow confines of strategic autonomy. We are off the deep end here because there is very little place of balancing and not annoying somebody or the other. A support or even a tacit support in terms of an abstention will be seen as pro-Russia. And any condemnation of Russia will be seen very badly by Russia. So I think we have a lot of skin in the game because we have very heavily invested relationships with both sides. And not just that, we also have to play we have to react to the principle of the thing. That if we agree that, this is a violation of international law, international borders, then we have to see that tomorrow, if something happens on some other international border, or maybe even a LAC, then how will the world react? So I think there has to be a balancing of all these costs, not to say the cost from Ukraine. I mean, the Ukraine ambassador, you said, has appealed, but because we do get a certain amount of defense equipment from Ukraine, besides our Indians who are, stuck there. So there are costs on each side. I think the issue is, can we still calculate the costs and see which side to lean towards, because a perfect balance in this situation is going to be virtually impossible to
But,
achieve.
but would you agree with Ambassador Karju that at least the way the statement is articulated, it looks as if we're leaning towards Russia because we have not even called this an ingress? Forget an act of war.
Well, I think all our statements so far have shown that. Even the first statement in the Security Council, was very careful about mentioning legitimate security interests, which was shortened for Russia's interests. So we did, it was read as leaning towards Russia. And I think that is why you see all the phone calls happening today. The foreign ministers had conversations with EU, UK, US, as well as the Russians have asked for India's support at the UN. I think there is going to be pressure, and there's going to be less understanding for a strategic autonomy kind of decision, perhaps, than would have been in the old non-aligned days, because you had a certain sort of moral underpinning to non-alignment, which you don't have on strategic autonomy. It's seen as an economic and military security construct. So I think, yes, so far the statements have been seen, because every time you try to balance in this situation, you will be seen as pro-Russia. And that's why, in fact, the Russian ambassador actually thanked us in the first statement.
You're actually making the point that if you don't outrightly condemn Russia, you basically appear to lean towards it.
Yes.
Yeah. So here's what before I get Jonah and Bhanu in, here's what the Ukraine ambassador to India had to say about what he thought Prime Minister Modi might be able to do.
One of the most powerful and respected world leaders is Modi ji. We are expecting that Modi ji will try to influence somehow Putin. We shall be also most grateful to the Modi ji for some words of support and maybe practical assistance to Ukraine.
Okay, so both Russia and Ukraine then at least looking towards India for some sort of support, some sort of intervention. But as Ambassador Navteej Sarna just said, Jonah, any statement that stops short of criticism of Russia looks like you're actually, kind of in Russia's corner. Jonah, Biden's response, does it make sense? I mean, at one level, the sort of disastrous pullout from Afghanistan would indicate the American mood, the mood of this administration to not fight wars on behalf of other nations. And that's clearly what's playing out here. But then that signals a new world order, the rise and rise of Russia, the rise and rise of China, and the weakening of the United States of America as a global player. And to that extent, this is not the old Cold War. Do you agree?
Yes, and thank you for having me on, Barkha. First off, I very much agree with both Ambassador Karju and Navteej about that this is not really an area where India can do a straddle. And I'd give an example that I think might resonate with your viewers. One of the criticisms that I had frequently in government from Indian interlocutors was that the United States was always trying to balance between India and Pakistan, always trying to take a middle path between a good international player, India, and a not good international player, Pakistan. And the United States was just trying to split the difference. And for what it's worth, I think that criticism was accurate. I think that you can't simply split the difference between an aggressor and his target. And I think that's where we are today with Russia and Ukraine. Russia is very clearly the aggressor, and Ukraine is very clearly the victim. And I do not think that India should be following anyone's interests other than India's. I don't think India should condemn Russia because the United States asks. I think that India should condemn Russia because it is in India's own interests. As Navtesh quite rightly pointed out, an expression of India's own values and the importance of a rules-based economy, particularly when a very powerful neighbor of India's claims Indian territory in Tawang and elsewhere across the line of actual control.
Yeah, that's a good point. But to the American response, what would you add? I'll take that back to the ambassadors,
No.
but to Biden's response, Jonah.
Yes. First off, I think that there is a very clear distinction, and Ambassador Kaju mentioned this, between a treaty ally and a country that is not a treaty ally. And President Biden made that crystal clear. He said the United States will defend with boots on the ground and with every U.S. troop necessary a treaty ally, because that's what a treaty ally means. Under Article 5 of the NATO treaty, an attack on one NATO country is equivalent to an attack on every nation within NATO. That's not true outside of NATO. And this is one of the key reasons that Putin was so keen on not having Ukraine join NATO. I think that the clarity that President Biden has given really was quite useful, because as my old boss used to say, great powers don't bluff. And in this case, I think if we didn't have that clarity, we might have a much more dangerous situation. Even though you're quite right, Barkha, that does mean that the Ukrainians are militarily going to be fighting on their own.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to say, that Putin is cognizant of the fact that there will be a military response from the West only if he takes this war to NATO nations, and he may not need to do that at all. The Ukrainian president is appealing to the world for military help, and that help isn't coming. Now, I want to, before I get Bhanu, give me a moment, Bhanu, I'll just get both ambassadors, Karju and Sarna, to respond to Jonah's point that it is in India's self-interest to take a principled position. Is it, Ambassador Karju? Is it in our interest?
I believe that it's in India's best interest to take a realistic position, given the constraints that India has, given its dependence in some areas, critical dependence on Russia still, and its growing interests with the United States. I think it is at such times that a country like the United States, which has interests in India too, needs to show an understanding of these interests and constraints. It's all very well to talk of principle, but when has the world been governed by principle? And Barkha, permit me one sentence here. This dichotomy, this contradiction between principle and realism is at the heart of the international system. And Jonah will accept this. On the one hand, the UN Charter talks of equality of states. And on the other, the UN Charter itself gives primacy to 5 states which have the veto to protect their interests, their security interests. Now, at that stage, I don't hear the United States president talk of equality and justice and equity. When it comes to the interests of the United States and other great powers, they don't talk of justice. And Jonah will agree, the record of the United States, now I'm not drawing any equivalence here, but the record of the United States through the years of the Cold War and later, to act most aggressively to protect its interests is there for everyone to see. So let's not talk of principle. My feeling is that it is incumbent on great powers, especially the veto-holding great powers. And they, mind you, even when there's talk of increasing the number of permanent members, there is no talk of giving them the veto. So there are these 5 countries who have arrogated to themselves the right of veto, elevating their self-interest more than others. Now, it is incumbent on them, one sentence, it is incumbent on them to reconcile their interests. And this is where, this is no justification for what Putin has done, but this is where they have failed for the last 20 years, when Putin was telling them time and again, please don't expand to my area, to the borders of Russia. They ignored him. Will the United States ignore their own interests if powers were expanding to their borders? Let's not talk of principle. Let's talk of realism.
Okay, I'll take that back to Jonah in just a moment, but let's just get Ambassador Naftesh Sarna to add to that. 2 of those 5 countries that have arrogated those powers to themselves are Russia and China. Imran Khan is sitting with Vladimir Putin. We chose, in a sense, to be part of a quad that could become irrelevant, because 3 of those 4 countries have taken a completely different position on this global crisis than we have as Indians. Naftesh.
Well, I don't think that we can afford to let the Quad become irrelevant, because we cannot ignore China. I mean, that's our immediate problem. Let's get that there. So I think when we do this calculation of realpolitik interests, which Ambassador Kachur referred to, I think one of the things will be China and how our relationship with the US, how the Russia-China axis, I mean, how is that going to play out? And that is why you will continue to see a lot of balancing, a lot of careful wording, a nod to a principle here and a calculation of real interest there. So I think, I don't think, unless Russia completely replaces China in Biden's mind, it might in the immediate few months. But I don't think China is going away anywhere. And China may well use this opening of the geopolitical chessboard being thrown up in the air. China may well use it for its long planned idea of unifying Taiwan with the mainland. So tomorrow it could be very much on the main plate. So I think as long as Indo-Pacific remains important, China remains important, I think Quad will remain important. Obviously, given the crisis situation that you're seeing in Europe, it will take a backseat for a while. But I think we have many sort of irons in the fire, which is there because we are a country which is trying to play a multipolar role and has become an important pole in different places, all in the interests of self-interest, national interest. Because we do have a China problem, we do have a Pakistan problem, and we have to handle these along with all the players, which is why we have to keep everybody happy. But I think the answer, if I could just take one more sentence, is that until this will carry on, until we have the capacity, a greater capacity, we can never have a complete capacity, but a greater capacity to defend ourselves in more on our own, to be able to resolve the issues on which we have this huge dependence on either side. And until that happens, I think, we have to play this game.
I think that's very honestly said by both Ambassador Karju and Ambassador Sarna. Before I go back to Jonah, I just want to bring in from Bhanu's perspective, an Indian who has lived in Ukraine. Bhanu, how many years have you actually lived and worked there?
I actually joke. It's first of all, thanks Barkha for having me over. I actually joke when I'm asked, "How long have you been in Ukraine?" I said, "Too long." It's the typical Russian black humor. Having said that, that's a lovely country. I've made friends out there who like family. And before I get to what you just asked, I'd like to just point about when Trump would speak, there was so much of lies. It's the same thing coming out from Putin. And Ambassador Kaju used the word, quoted him, denazification. Do you know the president of Ukraine is a Jew? Zelensky is a Jew. So using such loose language by president of Putin is ridiculous. And then saying that it's the country doesn't exist. It's no nation. It's something cobbled up. Now, how can another country, Russia is another sovereign state, Ukraine is another sovereign state, how can a president of another country say that country doesn't have a right to exist?
Yeah.
So it's,
Give, before you were
yes.
able to get out, before you were you able to get out right before the invasion?
See, actually, I came to meet my dad. My aim wasn't to get out, and we weren't expecting anything on this scale. So I probably was on probably the last flight out. So yes,
We've seen these dramatic images of a lone woman. It's reminiscent of Tiananmen Square. A lone woman basically telling the Russian troops in Ukraine to get lost in language that is worse than the one I'm using. Among the Ukrainian people, given that no military support is really coming from the West, Bhanu, how do you think this is going to play out? Will they just have to accept what's coming?
see, the Ukrainians are a very brave nation, and after two revolutions, and they were both anti-corruption, West-leaning revolutions. Ukrainians will not sit back, even if they are outnumbered, outgamed, outpowered by the Russian army, and you're seeing it happen. So, of course, they have the military mass. They've bombed the air defenses of Ukraine. The
Yeah.
tanks are almost outside Kyiv. I'm in touch with my friends. I reached out to you yesterday because I wanted the voice of an Indian living in Ukraine, and I mean, just get the information out because I find the Indian media is so confused, so biased, and it's sad. And when we talk about, I mean, of course, I really respect the Indian foreign ministry, especially Jaishankar, who's a career diplomat. We haven't had a minister of external affairs who's been a career diplomat. I mean, do you want India to be in the club of countries like North Korea, Cuba, China, Syria, Venezuela, when you sit on the United Nations and you support Russia? I mean, is that the kind of, we call ourselves the greatest democracy, and we are in this pitiable club of people, countries who are absolutely not democratic. I
This
mean,
is a
and
very, very, very interesting point that you raise. And can I pause you there? Though I understand and respect your emotions, I just want to bring in Jonah. You know, democracy summits and this sort of being the sort of, for the Americans, being the global arbiter of democracy came at great cost. Afghanistan, Iraq were disasters. Biden doesn't want to repeat that. That same pressure now on India to take a principled position. Uh, Vivek Karju and Naftit Sarna would tell you we can't be starry-eyed about democracy when it comes to hard-nosed democracy and a nation's own self-interest. Jonah.
Yes, well, it's really not just about democracy. If this were a democracy that had launched an unprovoked invasion of a peaceful neighbor, I would be advocating that that democracy be sanctioned as well. And just as to put my cards on the table, I was a very firm opponent of America's invasion of Iraq. I said so at the time. I very strongly counseled against America engaging in this disastrous and, in my view, unjustified endeavor. And America is a democracy. So it's not just about that. It's about the principle of one country not invading and taking over another, particularly without any sort of provocation. And I think that Bhanu has raised a very good point about one country doesn't get to say that its neighbor is a fake country and shouldn't exist. To get back to Navtej's point, China does not really accept that large parts of India are actually parts of India. It claims not only Tolong, but really every place that it says was once part of Tibet. And it takes that definition very, very broadly. You could even call all of Ladakh and much of Arunachal Pradesh, as well as a lot of other territories, Sikkim perhaps, as being part of what China considers to be its own nation. So I'm not at all advocating that India give up its own interests, quite the opposite. And I'm not advocating that India be starry-eyed about democracy. I am suggesting, as a friend of India, as someone whose in-laws are in India, that for India's own interests, that India side with the the nations that oppose one nation taking over another's territory, rather than kind of try a straddle that just won't work.
Okay, before I go back to Ambassadors Karju and Sarna Bhanu, what is your expectation at this moment of the Indian government, of the Indian state?
It's difficult for me to say what the Indian government will say or speak, because uh, I mean, I personally feel Russia needs India more than India needs Russia. And having said that, Russia has been backing India all throughout the United Nations Security Council meetings is not true. So it's also some time that India flexed its muscles. I'm not saying that India doesn't need to have its interests in place or toe the line of the NATO or the US, etc. No, have your interests, but don't be cowed down by old uh, uh, inertia of foreign policy. I think, I mean, if you are an emerging power and if you claim to be, I mean, again, you are a democracy, and a totalitarian regime is taking over a country which has democratic aspirations.
Yeah, I want to actually grab what you just said about, are we behaving like an emerging great power, or are we responding from muscle memory as we have always done for decades? Now, this is a year of multiple ironies. You even have a statement from the Taliban-led government in Afghanistan that is talking about. Negotiation and calling for restraint for both parties. I'm sorry, I'm laughing at this, but this is all sides need to desist from taking positions that could intensify violence, says the Taliban that grabbed power in Afghanistan. So, yes, it also is a reminder of how complex statecraft is and how there are no absolute principles, unfortunately, at play. But to the question raised by both Jonah and Bhanu, is India behaving like an emerging great power, or is India responding from old inertia? Ambassador Karju?
I think we are behaving like a power that is interested in looking after its own interests. There are certain continuities of the dilemma that we are facing now. But what has Ukraine, or the last events of the last 36 hours, profiled above all? It has profiled that when push comes to shove, and if there is a large-scale invasion, military operation, call it what you will, then will any of the other P5 put their troops on the ground to defend? No. So at the end of the day, if the Chinese were to move along the LAC, what Jonah is describing and describing it so well, can we expect the Americans to send aircraft, to send their vessels, to take on the Chinese? When did the Americans and the Chinese face off in military combat? If I recollect correctly, it was way back in 1951-52. After that, have they ever come face to face? Have any of the nuclear states' soldiers ever come face to face in battle? And that is what the Pakistanis do in terms of adventurism. No other nuclear state ever does this. It's much too dangerous in terms of escalation. Therefore, in these matters, while yes, of course, we should be in the court, and that's important to constrain, but let us not forget that states and big states like India, major states, and India is a major state, have to ultimately defend themselves with their own strength and power. They can't
Yeah.
depend on anyone else. And if my last point, if the Ukrainians were hoping that the Americans or NATO would put troops on the ground to face a Russian aggression, they were living in cuckoo's land. Because all through the Cold War and later, have the Americans and the Russians ever been locked in combat? Never. They fought proxies, but elsewhere through others.
Yeah.
You've seen this in Vietnam, you've seen this in Africa, you've seen this in Latin America. The last time was in Cuba, if I recollect. Let's forget Abel Archer. The last time was in Cuba in 62. And how did the Americans behave? How did Kennedy behave? The only thing he done was, if I recollect correctly, was a blockade, a naval blockade. So these powers don't come in combat because it's much too dangerous. And that is the lesson that all of us have to derive from this.
Can I get a quick response from Jonah before I give Ambassador Sarna the last word to that, Jonah?
Sure. I think that Ambassador Kaju is quite right that India should not expect U.S. military intervention against China. In each of the past three altercations along the line of control, India has not requested U.S. military intervention. There is a real distinction between a treaty ally and not a treaty ally. India has no desire to become a treaty ally of the United States, and the Quad is not a military alliance. So I don't think India would want to be an ally of the US.
No, this is true. This is true. But to the larger failure of the P5 to intervene, the toothlessness of the United Nations, all of those are glaring sort of examples of how countries are asked to stand on principle, but the great powers that have arrogated that sort of veto power for themselves do not.
Well, I think that there's a lot of fuzziness between in terms of what the United States and what NATO and what the UN are being asked to do. No one is really suggesting military intervention, but the idea of sanctions is sort of dismissed as irrelevant. And yet, as India knows all too well, sanctions can be a very painful tool, and the sanctions that are going to be imposed on Russia will be very painful for the United States, particularly for Europe, and for other nations as well. My own retirement funds, I have already dropped probably 10 or 20%, and I have every expectation that they're not going to recover for a very, very long time. Putin will not himself be harmed by these because he's got $600 billion left. But the fact that sanctions don't bring about immediate change does not mean that they are something simply to be discarded, as India has complained to me with justice many times when I've been in government.
Okay, let me give Ambassador Sarna the last word. But when it comes to principled positions, Germany, for example, has taken a position on the Nord Stream. There are countries that are standing up to take a position, even when it might not be convenient to do so. My question, quite simply, is: Russia says it expects India to back it at the UN. How do you think India will and should respond at the United Nations, Navtej?
I'm not going to be able to answer that, Barkha, because you're going to see what's going to happen. But I think that they will. If I'm to hazard a guess, I think it will be on the line of the statements we've made earlier, but it probably could see references to perhaps India's role in possibly the kind of conversation that Prime Minister Modi has had. And it could be, an updating of events. But I think there will be a certain amount of a certain amount of acknowledgement of the fact that violence has happened, etc. And again, I'm hazarding guess as to how it will be drafted. I don't know, but I think there will be a pure calculation of keeping both sides, of not making either side too unhappy. Let me say that, because no matter what you do, there will be a certain amount of cost. And just a word on the sanctions, which Jonah mentioned. I think there is, it's not correct quite that we have managed to unify NATO. Certainly not in terms of sanctions, because I was just listening to the Latvian foreign minister's interview, and he was very angry with continental Europe for not following up on the SWIFT sanction, for instance. Because and Nord Stream, I don't think is a correct parallel for a country. I mean, if we were under attack and we were in a conflict and we had a bilateral project, yes, we would obviously do some things different. So, the roundabout answer to your question.
Yeah, but it's a roundabout situation. India's response is likely to be roundabout. It's intricate. I was going to close, but Ambassador Kaju, go ahead. Last word. You want
On
to come
a
in?
on a somewhat lighter note, I think the Taliban follow our official spokesperson's statements very closely. They've used the word violence too, if you've noticed.
Yes, I did notice that. I did notice it. I just sometimes you have to pinch yourself to believe whether you're living in a real world where Imran Khan is talking about excitement in Russia as it invades Ukraine, where the Taliban is urging for restraint. This is certainly, to borrow from Trump, a post-truth world in so many ways. Bhanu, sorry, you were wanting to say something. Go ahead. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, please. Barkha, I understand the politics and the compulsions India has, but I do hope that the Indian media covers the story in a more human way, because the Indian media doesn't have these constraints of uh, alignment or I mean, this is a case of a totalitarian regime pounding another country just because they have another vision which is separate from theirs.
Yeah.
Ukraine wants to be a part of the EU. They do have NATO ambitions. They want to get out of the Soviet orbit because they've seen it. I've been during the Soviet times. I've lived there. It's a defunct system. You don't want to go back, and you don't want to be a part of Putin's Russia or a part of Belarus.
Yeah,
That is
I
the
hear,
aspiration.
I,
Yeah,
I,
go ahead.
I hear you, but my own sort of very layperson impression is that at the moment Putin is going to drag Ukraine to the dialogue table completely on his terms, and India is literally walking an intricate tightrope, not being able to look away from a possible China-Russia axis with Pakistan as a vassal accompaniment to that peace. These are really, really challenging times for diplomats, and I do not envy them. I will leave it there. Thank you, Bhanu, for your personal account. Jonah, Ambassador Kaju, Ambassador Sarna, thank you. And we will keep a close eye on this developing story. So do join us tomorrow again. Thank you for watching. Goodbye. It's great to see you here. Thank you for watching our work. If you haven't subscribed yet, don't forget to click the bell icon and subscribe to Mojo Story and support independent, robust journalism.